And it's just pretty much like there's this Mesopotamian combat myth between a storm deity and the sea deity, and how Jesus, like, conquering the storm and the sea was a polemic against those ancient Near Eastern things. So like that was another way of, so like not only is Jesus showing his deity through Old Testament allusions, but he's doing like multiple things at the same time as he's doing this. Like,
what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Things You Don't Hear in Church podcast. My name is Ethan.
And my name is Derry, and wouldn't you guess it, we are on social media. It's crazy. We don't say it every single time. You should check us out on Instagram. We have a Patreon. We have TikTok. We have everything you could imagine that we could have. We even have Facebook, even though we never check it. We do have Facebook.
Yeah, we will never get back to you. That's all right.
Actually, I respond to people sometimes.
There we go.
Because everything we post from Instagram goes to Facebook as well. So we have all of that. We'd love to interact with you guys. Love to hear your questions, your episode titles, all that kind of stuff. So hit us up on all those social medias if you would like to have that interaction on another like secondary platform outside of the audio or video version you're watching right now. And we'll kick it to Ethan.
Yeah, sweet. So today is going to be a really fun episode. We have is it Christophilus? What's your last name? I'm sorry. I'm probably gonna.
No, it's so good. It's Christophilus.
Christophilus. I was gonna say Christophilus. Yeah. Okay. We have Fan Christophilus joining us from Exploring Reality. This is a ministry on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, helping people bridge the gap from pop-level apologetics to scholarly work. And there's a part in Hebrews chapter 5 where it talks about going from milk to meat as you mature in Christ. And I really think that this channel helps capture that and helps bring people up to that level of meat where you go from like the normal everyday apologetics that you'd find in like, you know, a basic class or like the first intro book. And then he takes you to like the scholarly work that backs it. Like it's a lot more in depth and meaty into those topics. And so it's really helpful. I've enjoyed your YouTube channel, and Derry's enjoyed a lot of the other social medias as well. So thank you for coming on. Did we miss anything that you want to plug?
Yeah. No, you're good. I have a YouTube channel. If anybody that's listening to this ever has a question, I have a website, exploring-reality.com.
There you go.
And you guys can ask questions there. If you want it to be remain anonymous, just let me know. And if it's something that's you think I should cover, even let me know. That way I can make a video on it.
That's amazing. Cool. So there's like a little sections tab there or something on your website for like asking questions. Perfect.
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, it's going to be really exciting. Today we're going to be talking about the Bayesian Analysis. So I have like heard this in podcast episodes that I've listened to, and I just pretended to know what they were talking about.
Bayesian. I know.
I was like, everyone knows Bayesian. And I'm like, Derry, what's Bayesian? And so it's really exciting to have someone on to explain what a Bayesian analysis is, and then how we can use it to build a case for theism and Christianity. So this is going to be a beneficial episode in the way that when you walk away from it, you're going to probably have a better understanding of how to formulate logical steps to conclude that Christianity could be true.
At least theism.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the cool thing is actually depending on how much time I have, my full-fledged argument, we would probably I would ask that we would have like maybe 3 or 4 days of like 5-hour sessions.
Nice.
For the full-fledged argument. But for this, like just for today, what I have prepared is just kind of a brief overview of what Bayesianism is, and then kind of how we can use that to get us to theism.
Perfect.
So I have a few slides here. Let me pull this up.
Before that, really fast, I know we had talked about how you became a Christian in the first place. I would love to talk about that a little bit first.
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah.
Cool. So I was an atheist most of my life. I grew up like nominally Christian, since I'm Greek, so Greek Orthodox, but we didn't really, we were go to church on Christmas, people, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the faith wasn't really that important to us. It was a very just keeping up appearances type thing until I got to about middle school. Then we just stopped going altogether, and Jesus, God, never really came up. I learned about evolution, and then at that point I was like, yeah, God doesn't exist. And so the long story short of it is, it was my ex-girlfriend at the time, her dad is the person that introduced me to Christianity, really for like the first time. I was a firefighter at the time, and had a really rough call that just kind of really bugs me. Debriefed from it and everything, but you just still have to work through some of that stuff emotionally.
Yeah.
And he was kind of like a very prominent male figure in my life at the time. And he just said, like, look, I don't know how to help you through this kind of stuff, but here's a Bible, kind of a thing. And I thought it was really, I'll just be really blunt. I thought it was really stupid. Like, how is this going to help me? And so I just read through some stuff just to kind of keep him happy. Nothing really happened from there. Just fast forward a little bit more for sake of time. I went to church with her parents for the first time. My girlfriend at the time was an atheist too, so she didn't come with me. So it was just me and my ex-girlfriend's parents. Nice. And long story short, the worship music, I thought it was stupid. but I sat down just to like, I don't know, I was sitting down, and that's all I really remember. And next thing you know, I just kind of got hit with like what I would now call like the presence of God, giving me just this weird comfort in me as a gym rat. The analogy I use is like I had this like kettlebell inside of me, and it wasn't like the kettlebell got taken away. It was more like the kettlebell just got lighter as I was feeling that presence of like peace and like love and all this other stuff. And I just kind of chalked it up to the music. And that stuff kept happening. And then it got to the point where I was like, I'll try praying. And so I couldn't chalk up this next experience with God to naturalistic like things, because there's no music involved. I wasn't expecting anything. I just tried praying by myself one time, and that happened again.
Wow.
And so I kind of got to this point where in the course of like a few weeks after all of that, I was just kind of wrestling through some of those things about what it means to be a Christian. Do I really want to give up like all of this stuff that I'm doing and actually pursue like a life of repentance and faith? And then, I gave my life to Christ about a few weeks after that. That's like the bird's eye view of my testimony.
Nice.
Crazy.
Amazing.
That's awesome. I feel like it's a really special story. It's so interesting to see, like, some people will have these crazy experiences and some people just kind of choose based off of like hearing the gospel and being like convicted, and some people get into it through philosophy. It's so interesting to see how many different like experiences people have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, my mom was did some missions in Russia, and she said people would just like share the gospel, and people would be like, that makes logical sense, I'll become a Christian. I was like, wow, that's interesting. Based.
Yeah. Honestly, if it was that easy half the time,
yeah, right.
I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
You'd be on the streets all the time.
That's awesome. All right, let's talk about Bayesian analysis.
Yeah. What is Bayesian analysis?
Yeah. So I think what'll be really helpful here is talking about what we will talk about first and what the claim is, and then we'll go into just a brief overview of it. So on a slide you'll see the central probability of theism, God's existence given our data is higher than the probability of atheism. And then if there is any atheist listening that defines atheism as lack of belief, I'm accommodating by saying the negation of theism. So there's two ways, like there's two steps to this really. First step is just saying that theism is simpler than atheism, as it makes less foundational commitments. And this is going to be important when we start talking about prior probability, which we'll explain. And then step two would be that theism has more explanatory power than atheism. In other words, the world looks more like what we would expect if God exists than if God doesn't. And this is talking about like the posterior data and something we're going to call like conditional probability. So now be wondering, like, why is there this picture of pizza?
To make us hungry.
So this is like my typical analogy to kind of explain Bayesianism, because this is just how we normally think, like every day. So here's the scenario, and this is a real life scenario. I had pizza one day, and I was really excited to bring it to work. Put it in the refrigerator at work, and I'm waiting till lunchtime, so that way I can eat my pizza. It's buffalo chicken pizza, super pumped, right? Well, lunchtime comes around, and my pieces of pizza are missing. Right? So, right away, here's the question I'm answering. Why is the pizza missing? There's 3 people in the building, right? Person 1 has a wedding coming up, and she is trying to lose 15 pounds in the next 8 weeks. So she doesn't have much motivation to steal pizza and eat it, right? So that's important because the prior probability of person 1 taking the pizza is really low because she has motivation to not take it. And so it seems unlikely, at least before we start looking at evidence, right, that she would take it. Person 2 is lactose intolerant. And there's something we would expect to see on the condition that he did take the pizza, right? That's going to be some intestinal distress after eating cheese. And so this is where I'm going to introduce something called the conditional probability. So there's two ways we can look at person 2. Condition 1 would be they took the pizza. And so on this condition that person 2 took the pizza, there's something we would expect to see, which is intestinal distress. If person 2 did not take the pizza, something we would expect to see is not intestinal distress, right? And so we're not saying whether or not he took it or not. We're just saying this is what we would expect to see if he took it. Person 3 has a history of taking other people's food. And so it seems like the prior probability of him taking the pizza seems really high because he has a past of it. And so it seems like I don't have to make any extra assumptions about whether or not he would take it because he's done it in the past. So right now, the prior probability of person 1 taking it is really low. Person 2 is kind of neutral because we don't know anything other than what we'd expect to see if he had it. And person 3, it's really high because he has a past of doing it. I don't have to add on like ad hoc hypotheses to make it so that it's expected that he would have taken it, right? And so that's where we're at so far. Any questions on that?
That's great. Yeah. So basically, based on the evidence, you assign a different amount of probability to each of the people, right?
Correct. So not evidence yet. This is background knowledge.
Gotcha.
So this is where we start getting to the evidence. Now I'm going to actually start investigating and finding new data. So for instance, I go up to person 1, but I actually find out person 1 actually left the office at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. So she could not have taken the pizza because it wasn't missing at that time, and she's been gone. So new data, that's evidence that needs to be taken into account in like the posterior side, and that's massively disconfirming of the person 1 hypothesis, right? And so probably, given our background knowledge and the posterior now, person 1 probably did not take it, right? Person 2 is not having intestinal distress, and so that is massively disconfirming that person 2 took the pizza because on the condition that they did take it, we would expect them to be having intestinal distress because they're lactose intolerant. So the prior probability of person 2 taking it was moderate, but the posterior shows that it's actually massively disconfirmed because what we'd expect to see on the condition that person 2 took it is not there. So that's disconfirming data against the person 2 hypothesis. So at the moment, the probability of person 3, given our data and the background knowledge, is very high. So I'm going to go to person 3 now and ask him some questions. And as I approach, he smells like buffalo. Right? So that smells, new data.
Can't
all of a
stand
sudden,
person 3.
the prior probability is high, and I have new data that's like raising the the posterior. So now I'm going to ask him, like, hey, did you take my pizza? And he turns around with a Tupperware full of buffalo chicken pizza, but there's no pizza. I mean, buffalo chicken, sorry. He turns around with a Tupperware full of buffalo chicken, but there's no pizza. So it seems like I have to update my belief now about person 3 based off that new data that actually is related to the old data, if that makes sense. So it's like, okay, so he couldn't have, so that can't be taken into account to this person 3 hypothesis. So I ask him, like, okay, well, did you take my pizza? Because you're the only person left. And he says no. He's very adamant about it. I don't know if I trust them, but I'm frustrated, and I go into the back just to kind of take a break from this. It's at this point, it seems like person 3 is the most likely to have taken the pizza. But as I open up the door to go into the back room, I actually have a 4th person I didn't know about in the back, and he's eating my pizza. And so now my priors get updated because I have to include this 4th person into the candidate hypothesis pool, take into the new data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. This just seems like normal everyday thinking, right? But that's Bayesianism in a nutshell. It's just a formalized way that we do inductive investigations. Just when it comes to everything, right? And we use this when it comes to science. We use this when it comes to history. Everything. Like the theory of evolution relies on this whole entire premise. And so that's Bayesianism in a nutshell.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Cool.
Really simple. It's I think this is like a fun way of just kind of showing that it's not this big scary thing. You don't have to know the equations, which we could go over if you wanted to, but you don't have to know those. This is just how we think, and this is how philosophers and philosophers of science think.
Is there a way to do Bayesian analysis better than not very good? Because it seems like I could be maybe not have the most like logical mind and assign improper probabilities to like each one of those people just based off biases or something. Is there a way to keep us kind of like on track? Like you said, there's some kind of formula.
Yeah, so there's Bayes' theorem, and that's just gonna be a probability calculus that you assign things, but that's not gonna help you in terms of figuring out how to quantify some of these things. Because for instance, in this scenario, and even when it comes to theism itself, you're using something called epistemic probability, which is a fancy word for just saying these are not literal numbers for quantifying things. We're giving more qualitative probabilities to this. So we can say things like less likely, moderately likely, or very likely versus saying like 0.25. Right. That gets really subjective when we're doing Bayesianism. And so that's why the claim that I'm making is the probability of theism is higher than the probability of atheism.
Gotcha.
I'm not saying that the probability of theism is not 0.99. I'm just saying it's much more rational given our data to be atheist than an atheist.
Cool.
Gotcha.
That's awesome. Well, let's get into it then.
Cool. So let me get rid of this. This is bothering me. Oh my goodness. All right. So we're going to assess the prior probability of theism versus atheism here. And this is important just because the simpler hypothesis is, the higher the prior probability is. This is called the principle of parsimony. In the popular level spheres, you know this as Occam's razor, which you might actually hear like atheists talking about a lot, right? And so simplicity allows us to assess the prior probability. The reason why this is the case is because if a hypothesis has less ways to go wrong, the higher its probability is. So if I have a hypothesis that has 4 contingent statements in it versus 1, that's 4 ways I could get something wrong or as an assumption wrong versus 1. And that's why the single hypothesis is more likely than the 4 hypothesis. Simple enough?
Yeah.
Cool. So do you guys know any of the philosophers of religion that are active contemporary right now?
If you named them, I might be able to remember, but
okay. Yeah, so Graham Oppy and Paul Draper. If you've heard
I listened to a few debates by them, yeah.
Okay. So this is the way that they like to assess simplicity. So what they'll say is, okay, here's 2 possible hypotheses. This is going to be theism and this is going to be atheism. The way we want to count this up is we want to count up the total number of things in each world, and the world that has the most things is the more complicated one. So if this was the way we counted things, obviously world 1 is going to be a lot more complicated than world 2, right? And so what the atheist wants to say is something like, well, theism is more complicated than atheism because we all believe in the same amount of things. You're just adding God. right? Here's the issue with that. So take our standard model of particle physics. This is a pretty widely accepted model, and it postulates 16 fundamental particles to explain various data in need of explanation. These are all non-observable entities. We can't test them physically. We only know they exist with a high probability based off of the data that we explain through them, right? And so the issue is if philosophers and philosophers of science and scientists measured probability of the simplicity of a hypothesis like this, it would actually undercut pretty much everything that we do in science. Because, for instance, it would be simpler to say that the 16 fundamental particles don't exist, and all the data that we're trying to explain, they're just all brute facts. A brute fact would just be a contingent fact that has no explanation, right? But then all of a sudden I can easily say, like, well, all these brute facts that we're trying to explain, well, we don't have to explain those anymore. These fundamental laws of nature, for instance, those don't actually exist. All the data that we're seeing, for instance, like my phone dropping, I don't have to posit gravity anymore. That's just a brute fact that it's falling. It would undercut evolution. You get the point, right? Because it'd be so much simpler to just say everything's a brute fact versus postulating an actual theory to account for the data. And so, in other words, what we should be doing is, instead of counting everything within the worldview, like Graham Oppie and Paul Draper want to say we should, I'm saying, and philosophers of science and not many people are going to say, we should be actually just looking at the fundamental theory, not the end states of affairs that come from it. Otherwise, we run into really bad counterexamples. We clear on that?
Yeah.
Good? Cool. So, with that in mind, let's compare theism to atheism then. It depends on your model, obviously. So, the way I kind of like model out God, which to a lot of people that are average people in the pew, once they hear model of God, they get kind of scared. Like, what does that mean? This is just like a conceptual way of putting together the hypothesis of what God is, who God is, all that stuff. And so for me, I'm just saying theism is that the foundation of reality is one entity, and God has one property, which is perfection. And then from perfection, we get the omni properties, right? But because perfection is the only property he has, and those omnis are entailments, it doesn't complicate the theory at all. It's just one entity, one property, held with no arbitrary limits. And so, in other words, I'm saying God holds his property of perfection in an unlimited amount of way, or if there is some sort of limit on there, the limit is explained internally to God. It's not arbitrary, meaning that there's no like cutoff.
Right.
So if we don't have to like quantify God's perfection, if as weird as that sounds, like if God had a perfection quantity of 94, I don't even know what that would mean, but that would be explained by something internal to God through like logical necessity. Whereas atheism, on the other hand, I don't know how the atheist is going to escape having their fundamental theory being at least these 16 fundamental particles, right? Now, add on like the fundamental laws of nature that we have throughout the universe. Add on, if they're a moral realist, all the moral facts they'll have to count up. You kind of get the point.
Yeah.
So far, we have 16 fundamental particles plus whatever else they want to say is part of fundamental reality. But on top of that, all these 16 fundamental particles are going to have arbitrary limits, whether these are limits on their like drift, spin, et cetera, right? If you know anything about particle physics. And so the theory is simpler because we have one entity, one property held in the simplest way, where this is at least 16 fundamental particles with many, which are all brute facts, and they have all arbitrary limits. And so, any question on that?
No, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So the question now is like, somebody might push back and say like, well, why is zero limitation simpler? And so this is kind of a thought experiment to kind of bring this out. Suppose that the fundamental reality had the following basic attributes: a mass of 241 grams, the shape of a sphere, and the capacity to produce exactly 288 particles. Nothing can explain these cutoffs and the geometric structure or anything like that, because nothing would exist outside of it if it's fundamental reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
By contrast, let's just say the foundation is unbounded, so it has no mass, no shape, and the capacity to produce any number of particles, right? I don't have to go back and try to explain any of these arbitrary cutoffs. Right. It's simpler to explain this in such a way, for instance, it's simpler to say this because, first of all, I don't have to have on like an ad hoc supposition, right? To say like why it has this arbitrary cutoff or anything, because there is no arbitrary cutoff. So it's simpler to explain, it's simpler to describe, and it has no arbitrary limits. And in the history of science, this is kind of what we prefer. So for instance, our current measurement of the speed of light or hypothesis is 299,792,458 meters per second. Before new data that disconfirmed it came along, though, we used to postulate that it was infinite. And we see this kind of thing in this preference within the history of science in general. And so that's kind of why, this is why it's so much simpler to have on no arbitrary limits in things held in an infinite way versus a finite way. And so, so the prior probability of theism. Go ahead.
Well, so could it be that, like, going back to the slide right here, that the atheist would say these fundamental realities, or like the way nature is, just these are brute facts of the world, we don't have to explain them, but then we would say, well, they actually can be explained through God, and we would say God is the brute fact that we're relying on. So then could it be that we're just both relying on different brute facts, just ours explains theirs?
Yeah, so I would push back against this idea that God is a brute fact. Like Graham Oppy wants to say that God would be a brute fact because the way Oppy defines a brute fact is anything without an explanation.
Right.
But that just doesn't seem right to me.
Okay.
Right? Like if something is necessary, we have an explanation of its necessity through either its logical necessity or metaphysical necessity. Right.
Okay.
And so, for instance, I would just give up some sort of like I think there's one ontological argument that I think actually works to get to logical necessity. Otherwise, you can get through to metaphysical necessity through some sort of like contingency style argument, right?
Whose ontological method do you like?
Rasmussen's new one.
Okay, yeah.
From Value.
Yeah.
If you've heard of it.
Yeah, I watched a podcast on it, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those arguments that I don't like that it works. I feel like there's something I'm not seeing.
Yeah.
And so like I'm really skeptical of it. That's why I don't really talk about it much yet. But anyway, so that's one way of like. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
Anyways, back on the slides.
Yeah. So you get the point. So far, like the prior probability of theism is higher than the prior probability of not theism. Because it's a lot simpler of a foundational theory than any other theory that I think is possible for the non-theist to put up. So the next thing we're going to jump into is like the posterior side of things. This is where things can kind of get a little finicky. So the big thing I want to hit on is theism's explanatory power. Explanatory power is just any hypothesis ability to make sense of data.
Okay.
Or like how expectable the data is on the condition that the hypothesis is true, right? And so when we want to ask like so now we have to ask like, well, what would we expect on the condition that God exists? Like what would we expect the world to look like? And I'm going to say that theism predicts valuable states of affairs. So in the philosophy of religion side of things, this is theism is what we would call an axiarchic theory. Axiology is just the study of value, right? And so the reason why I'm going to say this is, and I highly recommend two sources on this. One would be Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, and then I forgot who wrote this for some reason off the top of my head. It's called The Miracle Theism. And they both dig into this in their own way and justify this in their own way. But there's this thing called the Dionysian Principle that just says that goodness is by its very nature diffusive of itself and thereby being. In other words, good agents would want to make good things and valuable things, right? And I think this is just pretty self-evidently true. I mean, if anybody that's listening is a parent, right, you most likely, hopefully, wanted to make a child because you recognize it as a valuable thing to do. That's why my wife and I have 2 kids and a third one on the way. We love having kids.
There we go.
So that's just like a everyday example of why we should affirm this. And so because of that Theonysin principle, the probability of any data point we see on the condition that theism is true is in direct proportion to the intrinsic value of the data point, right? So anything that's modestly valuable will be modestly expected on theism. Anything that's extremely valuable will be extremely expected on theism. So the question then is like, how do we see value? And there's 3 things that Josh Rasmussen brings up in his book, How Reason Can Lead to God. So one way is going to be through direct awareness. And by that, I'm just saying, just like you can have like direct mental awareness that 2 + 2 = 4, I think you also have direct awareness at things that are valuable, right? So for instance, if I had 2 hypothetical scenarios, I told my wife, hey, you're amazing, you're beautiful, and I love you. And the other scenario is, hey, you're a cow, and you smell bad, and I hate you, right? You intuitively like feel and see the difference in those, right? And I'm going to argue in the same way that you see the difference in those through direct awareness, you can see what's valuable and what's not.
Absolutely.
The other way would be through uniformity. And so I think reality works in this way that there's this principle of uniformity, that if we trust our senses, we should be trusting our other senses as well. In other words, I trust my eyesight to tell me, right, that I'm talking to you guys, my ears to hear, like I can hear you guys talking back to me. You get the point. I think it would be a breaking of the principle of uniformity to say I trust those senses, but not my sense of moral intuition, my value, my axiological intuitions. Unless you can present something to me that tells me like why we shouldn't trust that, I think it's arbitrary to say, well, we don't trust that and we can't see value because of that.
Right. Seems self-evident.
Yeah. And so the third one would just be through desire. And so what I mean by this is if you desire to deny the existence of value itself or that we can see value, it seems like it's self-defeating in a way, right? Because if you deny the existence of value and you deny that your intuitive ability to see value, well, you're also thereby saying that you deny the value of you denying the existence of value and the ability to see value. So there's no value in you denying it, so why are you even trying to deny it? Right.
Self-defeating.
And so it seems like that's self-defeating. And so I think the most rational thing to do here is just to be able to take our senses as actual data when it comes to seeing value. Any questions on that?
No, that's good.
I love it. Yeah.
Cool. So there's a lot of data we can go over. The ones I want to kind of just focus on is fine-tuning of the universe that allows for embodied conscious moral agents. That's us. And then after that, I'll kind of just show and broadcast a few other things that we can go through. So fine-tuning, the basic here is the probability of a life-permitting universe given theism is higher than the probability of a life-permitting universe given not theism. So in terms of fine-tuning, a law of nature is just defined as a regularity in the causal powers and liabilities of various kinds of objects. Simple enough?
Yeah.
So there's tons of, like, we have over 800 examples of different fine-tuning like pieces in the universe. This is just the 4 fundamental forces. The one I'll really focus on is the strong nuclear force, right? So in a nutshell, particles will repel each other if they're likely charged. For instance, positively charged particles will repel with up to like 20 pounds. And while that might seem like negligible to us, in the particle world, I think it's like almost 8,000 miles per second that they're actually going to be repelling each other with, right? So like the question's like, well, what holds that together? And that's the strong nuclear force. It's this weird force that pushes particles together even though they're repelling each other, and that's what like binds things together to form like quarks and all these other things. If the strong nuclear force though was slightly longer in range, too many heavy elements for physical life to be possible would form. If it was slightly shorter in range, too few heavy elements would form for physical life to be possible. If it was 4% stronger, something called the diproton would form, and stars would exhaust fuel too quickly for physical life to be possible. If it was 10% weaker, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen would be unstable, and again, life would be impossible. So now the question's like, well, why is the theistic hypothesis the one that explains this better, right? Well, this is where it goes into the embodied conscious moral agent side of things. It seems on the hypothesis that God exists, we would be more likely. For instance, we can choose between good and evil, but God would want us to be like embodied and limited, and have a limited spatial temporal profile, because, well, if we were unlimited and we didn't have a finite spatial temporal profile and power and all this other stuff, we would have, well, the freedom and unlimited power to do unlimited power of evil. In other words, we would just have complete chaos. So God would have motivation to give us limited spatial temporal profiles in order for us to be able to have the ability to choose between good and evil, because that's a valuable thing. But on the same side of the token, we're limited, so that way we don't just choose to do a bunch of evil and cause chaos. And so having these limited spatial temporal profiles, the ability to touch each other and all this other stuff, right? It gives us the ability to do valuable things. Like, I don't know if you guys are fathers or if you can see the value just in the picture, but right, like, this is a valuable thing, man. Like, I don't have a daughter, but I have sons, and the ability to hug my children and show them affection is a very valuable thing. Like, you're starting to get the picture here. Like, too often I think we're so familiar to our experience that we don't actually get to see the value of things. Like, why do we live in a reality that I get to hug my son and talk to him? Why do I live in a reality where I get to even ask the question, why do I live in a reality like that? And so you kind of get in the point. Now we combine the two things, like the physical laws, though, to learn things too. For instance, we get to learn valuable things, like if I plant seeds, I get to use the laws of nature to help grow food and help my community grow. But I also have the value of learning that if I punch somebody in the face, it's going to hurt them. And so these physical laws actually have what's called like a lethic value as well. Not only do they allow for us to have existence itself in terms of like that sort of value, but then we also have the lethic value, which is like truth-finding value, is how I try to popularize that. In other words, these laws allow us to actually learn and grow, right? For instance, why are we even doing this? We find a lethic value in the fact that we get to learn about these things, and in the same way, the fundamental laws of nature and our limited spatial temporal profiles give us a lethic value to learn things as well. And so this is the main idea. God would want to create embodied conscious moral beings with significant moral freedom, and a necessary condition for number one is that a life-permitting universe with laws of nature that also allows us to use the regularities to predict the effects of their actions. And so, in general, the probability of those two things given theism is higher than the probability of atheism. And then so this one's a little bit complicated. I'm hoping I can help this out here, but long story short, consider like the current state of the universe is S1. And we can explain state of the universe S1 by state of the universe S2 and law 1, which brought S1 into being. And we can kind of keep going backwards and backwards and backwards until we get to a certain point. And we can explain all these things through law 1, law 2, and then like more general laws of nature, but sooner or later we get to this point where there's no material thing that's going to explain all these more general laws. And so we get to this point where really I don't see how atheism can posit this unless they're positing some sort of non-physical concrete thing, which that's not of mind, and I have no clue what that would actually be. If that makes sense. And by concrete, I'm saying it's immaterial and it has causal power, but the only thing out there that I know of, the only like candidate hypothesis out there that I know of that's immaterial yet concrete is going to be a mind. And so this data seems like inexplicable on theism. The naturalist or the atheist is going to have to posit all of these as separate brute facts. And so if the atheist wants to do that, that's fine. They'll match the explanatory power, but at the massive cost of simplicity, though, if that makes sense. So
that makes a lot of sense.
That's the data. That's the argument in a nutshell, right? For these two data points, the fine-tuning the universe that allows for embodied conscious moral agents is more expected on theism than atheism. Then there's other things we could talk about, right? Like moral facts, for instance.
Right.
I think depending on your model of God, moral facts existing is more expected on theism than atheism. Moral knowledge, and that would be another one. For instance, we could conceive of a world where you and I don't have the knowledge that it's better to hug my son versus punch him, right? Why do we live in a reality that allows me to actually know those things? Well, it seems really likely under this theistic hypothesis, right, that God would want us to know those things so we're made with those like intuitive knowledge things. Psychophysical harmony is this idea that actually it wasn't even theists that came up with. It's just pretty much this idea that physical states are correlated to mental states. And so in other words, like my mental state of me touching my hands together is actually representative of a real physical state. And that psychophysical harmony lends itself to me being able to learn things, stay alive, all sorts of stuff. And so this is something that's been puzzling like philosophers for a very long time. And it's really interesting because, like I said, like it's atheists that really talk about it, and they'll say something like, well, if there was this omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, like that would make sense of this, but that's not true.
Right.
So let's just figure something else
That's so funny. I had the other day I was talking to someone who's one of our students here in one of our schools. I don't know which one, I forget. But we were talking about apologetics and like fine tuning and stuff like that. And they're like, yeah, I don't know. They're like, I haven't found the fine tuning argument to be very powerful. And I was like, how much have you looked into it? Because this is like one of the most powerful evidences we have. Like there's atheists, I like quoted that same thing where it's like, it looks like the universe is fine tuned and by a God, but we know that's not true because God doesn't exist.
And the amount of quotes you can find from scientists saying that exact same thing, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
That's why I really like the fine-tuning argument. It's really powerful.
Yeah.
I think the reason most people don't find it powerful is because the way it's typically presented is like methodologically flawed, right? And that's the reason why I think it is, because people don't. I think this Bayesian way of showing it is much better than like a deductive argument that says that fine-tuning proves God's existence.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Would that be a way of it being flawed? Like if we say it proves God's existence?
Yeah, because the proof is something that like it's logically impossible for the conclusion to be false given our premise, right?
Right.
And I don't think there is a formulation out there that can prove it 100% true to be God.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Makes sense.
Just give some weight.
Yeah. I think there's a series of deductive arguments you can make that get to theism. That's something I'm working on, but it's a lot. It's very cumbersome. So I'd rather just go the probability route.
Yeah. So let's say somebody rejected. I know we talked about this being self-defeating, but they rejected value as like a concrete fact from the beginning. How much damage would that do to the embodied moral agents part of the argument?
Yeah. So it would do. Well, let's just put it this way. This methodology wouldn't work if they're really insistent on doing this, and that's where I would just switch to like a deductive argument method. But it's also just not like a fight I'd be wanting to give up, right? Like I'd be prepared to argue for the reality of value.
Right.
You could swing this. Some philosophers do this. I'm just a little skeptical of it. You could swing this and just say like, well, that's fine. We could do this on like a non-realist axiarchic theory and just say something along the lines of like, let's just say value isn't real, but we still have these intuitions of what's what's valuable and what's not. And so given like God's existence, you would at least expect some sort of like emotivist if you guys know what that means. Okay, an emotivist like conception of value, which is cooperative of like what this person would want to deny and say like, well, the right value is not real. It'd be compatible, and you could just say like, okay, on this emotivist conception, like we could still run the argument because on atheism, I don't see why we would even have these experiences,
right?
Type thing. So you could still run it that way. I'm a little skeptical of it, but that's one way you can go about this.
Yeah, I've never heard anyone make that argument, but that's interesting.
Yeah,
we run into people all the time doing evangelism that will make that point, and usually I'll just go it from a different direction instead of the one I was trying to go from.
That's what I do.
Yeah,
I like to keep things as open as possible. So it's like if you're not a moral realist or a value realist, I'm like, okay, let's just work with something else.
Right. Right.
So, yeah, man. Other things are like reason, so just like our ability to reason, but like the laws of logic, stuff like that. Consciousness is a huge thing. I actually think it's metaphysically impossible for atheists to, well, yeah, I'll say that. I think it's metaphysically impossible for atheists to say that their theory can account for consciousness, because I think all types of physicalism are going to be false. Physicalism just being this thing that says like your mind is identical to the brain. So I think this is a really strong one.
Yeah.
And one you don't see talked about too much is miracle accounts.
Yeah, I just saw your TikTok about this.
Oh, really? Oh, the one where I said that the argument for miracles is like the atheist problem of
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think it's a very strong argument. If you've seen, I have a few videos on my YouTube channel just going over like the epistemology of miracles, the methodology, all this other stuff, and it's really similar to what this is, but it's more, what's the probability of the miracle being an authentic miracle given the data versus the probability of it not being an authentic miracle given the data type thing. And the amount of miracle accounts that are out there that I think are authentic is just shatters atheism. So yeah,
that's awesome. I love the argument from consciousness. I've seen a lot of really good videos on that as well. And yeah, the case for miracles, I feel like people will just assume, like off the top of their head, like miracles can't be proven. So even if you've experienced something, it's just you, and it's not good evidence no matter what. And it's just like the normal like presumption. But a really good case can be made.
Yeah, we have a few really good cases on a channel. There's a lot of peer-reviewed papers out there that just won't call it a miracle because of the stigma that comes with it. But they'll say this is medically inexplicable.
Right.
Yeah.
And they'll even say like it could not have, like based off what we know, it could not have been explained by something natural phenomena. Right. And if you want to make some like for instance, like there's macular degeneration cases, or one of my favorites is like this guy's intestines were actually taken out through surgery, and he was prayed for, and then he had not an ultrasound, MRI or something like that done, and then he